Now, I wonder how our discussions have gone. Is now a good time to start our Q&A? Okay, thank you very much. I also forgot to mention, just before I left you for that discussion as well, because Robert Watson did emphasise the impact of climate change and biodiversity loss. We have already had a Citizens' Assembly on climate change in 2018, and they have recommendations published, many of which are already in the Climate Action Plan that government has in legislation, but it might be something you might want to Google. It's actually on the Citizens' Assembly website. So while those conversations have happened, but we definitely won't neglect it in our own conversations as well. So I just wanted to note that before we went ahead. So I understand the facilitators have been asked to have some questions ready in case they weren't forthcoming, but I imagine that they were, because I think Robert Watson managed to squash a lot into his 20 minutes there. It's unfortunate he can't be with us to answer those questions himself. Perhaps at some point in the future we might see if he's available again. But our EAG are a wonderful substitution for that, and I hope you can ask them really, really difficult questions to put them on the spot, make sure they've earned their place on the EAG today. Would anyone like to start off the conversation today? And I will ask you to maybe just introduce yourself to the group. We'll all get to know each other over the next 6 months. But would anyone like to cur their lawsuits to begin our discussion? I don't want to ask a question because I actually haven't sat and thought about it for 20 minutes because I've had to go and do busy work. So your questions will be far. Thank you very much. Would you mind introducing yourself? Oh, sorry, Jenny, we'll have a microphone to you. I'm going to get the table plans.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jenny. A very simple, fully loaded question. What does good look like? For biodiversity, what does good look like?
Who would like to take that question? What does good look like in terms of biodiversity? Is that it, Jenny? Yeah. Taz?
I guess that the fingers point in my direction in answer to that one. That's a very good question. Closer, yeah. So yeah, so that's a very good question, and not one that's easy to answer, as all good questions are. So I would say you would aspire towards a system that might be considered as natural as possible, that is not feeling the kind of is not showing the symptoms of the activities that we're imposing upon it, so that it would be, fully functional with the full suite of species and ecosystem processes that would be prevalent in that area. The question that follows from that then is, well, what is natural, and how do we define that? And that's been a matter of some debate and discussion, because you can't easily aspire to turn the clock back 100 years or 200 years or 5,000 years in any meaningful way, and it's a bit arbitrary where you choose to try to turn the clock back to. So I think we are looking at a natural world that has gradually evolved and changed to be a world that exists with people in it as well. There are many ecosystems that have been formed and shaped by human activities. So I think it is a conversation. There's a discussion around what we should be trying to aim for, and you are very much part of that discussion. Certainly, we don't want to be seeing species driven to extinction. We want to be removing the pressures that are doing that. And we want to be finding systems that are as natural as they can be at this point in time, perhaps, and looking to move the ones that are degraded towards that state would be my take on it. So there are systems around Ireland and around the world that are in a more natural state than others, and we should be trying to move towards the current level of as close to natural, as close to pristine as we can get. So a bit of a nebulous answer, I'm afraid, but the discussion will continue around that topic, I'm sure.
Okay, thank you, Taz. So that we have, sorry, table 2, perfect, yeah. Sorry. Thank you.
Hello, yes, Chairperson, thanks for your invite here today. My name is Peter. Just a general question on behalf of the group. Our group understands that education and awareness is an important challenge. What has been done in Ireland, and is it even enough at the moment?
So in terms of education and awareness, Peter, yeah, that's a great question. Micheal, might you take that one, please? Thank you.
Thank you very much. A really good question. Short answer is not enough. But if you look at the structure of the primary and the secondary school curricula, and even probably would be very familiar with some of this, in the junior cycle, for example, there has been a fair amount of restructuring of the curriculum so that there's more goals and outcomes, including on sustainable development or sustainability. So some of the subjects like geography and science, there are questions and topics that are part of the learning outcomes in the junior cycle. Another place in Ireland, and I'm just talking within the school system for the moment, where there is room and there's a lot of good work happening, is in transition year. So those of you that have kids in transition year, in some parts of Ireland, there's really good work being done by local groups to bring biodiversity, climate, sustainability into modules, and there's NGO groups doing that, and the Department of Education are supporting that, and the Department of Education have a strategy on education for sustainability. But my own comment, both from looking at it from the point of view of being a public servant but now involved with NGOs in the west of Ireland, is that it's not enough. So there is huge scope for more work to be done, first of all at the formal education level, in terms of bringing climate change, biodiversity loss more into the rest of the curriculum. In other words, outside of junior cert and outside of transition year, but really fair and square into the senior, kind of what I would call senior hurling league, which is the leaving cert, because the leaving cert tends to be separate from it. And then there is a challenge for universities, and some of the universities are, reaching out more or getting into that space. But beyond that, we have to provide, as a community, mechanisms where the rest of the community learns this idea of education and awareness. A lot of that, to be honest with you, is left to organisations such as non-profit NGOs doing great work with very limited resources, and I think that's not enough. Ireland Inc. Society, all of our communities around the country, we have about 800 or 900 tidy towns. There are groups, there are mechanisms that could be supported to do more in terms of education and awareness, and it's a conversation that has to be had for the whole country. So I think you pointed to one area where I think recommendations will come for a lot more of what we're doing. Thank you.
Thanks, Micheal. Peter. So we'll get the microphone to you.
Sorry. Just by coincidence, I have a daughter in transition year, and we were trying to link them up with tidy towns, Rotary Club, etc., and it just fell between the cracks. And TY is it's probably something that should be pushed in TY a bit more. They're the future, and everybody has their own opinion on TY, but I think the opportunity is there to push it through TY because they are the future.
Thanks, Peter. It's certainly something we'll talk about. Sorry,
I might just add one, seeing as you came back to transition here. Cooperation North or Cooperation Ireland are supporting a project application at the moment from a group led by a fellow called Duncan Stewart. Some of you will know him. He's an environmental educator, and it's called EcoEd for All. They have developed online material on climate change, on education, on waste for schools in the Galway area and in Laois. And it's because it's online, it's available anywhere in the country. And Cooperation North are at the moment in discussions with Pobble to fund, let's say, a rollout of that both north and south of the border. So that's again an example of an NGO initiative that could be rolled out and supported more. Thank you.
Thanks, Micheal. Mary?
Thanks very much for the question. Just to add in a little bit, so firstly, yes, there's a lot of reliance on NGOs, on sort of the ordinary individuals. I think this is also part of what the Citizens' Assembly is going to be about in the self-education for all of us during this process, and then sharing those outputs and also providing recommendations at the end in relation to education will be crucial. As well as what Micheal was saying about the developments within school, weirdly I'm on a committee with Taz and one of the observers, Diarmaid Torney at the back there, and we're also looking at developing sort of online sharing of education, essentially resources from third level institutions, but that's accessible to the public within this as well. So I think it's upon all of us to try and educate ourselves, and I'm not trying to take away the responsibility from the government or from the state in this, but the responsibility is on all of us as well to make sure we access and avail of valid, factual information and help try and inform ourselves, as we will be doing over the next few months, and then sharing those out as well. So thank you.
Thank you, Mary. And just to note, because we haven't mentioned it so far, we will have a Children's Citizens Assembly on biodiversity loss, which will feed into our work. It's something that at the very beginning we've spoken about with the Secretariat, that under 18s can't participate in this assembly, but this is very important to them, so we want to hear from them, and we will have a schools competition in that, where they'll feed in submissions, but we also will have the Children's Citizens Assembly. We're ironing out the details, but Diarmuid and Clodagh are part of that, so we will have young people involved, and that may cross the education landscape. To come from my own perspective, formal education gets overloaded and it's curriculum overload, and TY often gets a lot of things dropped into it, so it will certainly be part of our conversations, and we will make that we will have that towards the end, but it's certainly something that we should all be aware of. So another person from table 2, and then we had someone from table 3 as well, so we'll take the microphone here first.
Yeah, my name is Hilary. Just very briefly, when we discussed about education, it wasn't necessarily the education system, and I think that's really important, because it's the broader public. I think everybody needs to understand what's on their plate, where it came from, and how that impacts biodiversity. So the education system, of course, is one key way of getting the message across, but there's a big brother public out there.
Absolutely, the public dissemination, the informal education. Thank you, Hilary. So we had a question from table 3 as well.
My name is Brendan. We've just had an interesting initial discussion at the table, and I suppose what we ask ourselves to facilitate the efficient operation of the Assembly, are we accepting that there is a biodiversity crisis, and that Ireland has already a certain set of policies or initiatives, and that we're going to work from there looking at solutions, rather than sort of a lot of debate about, well, is there a real problem or is there not a problem?
This is a great question, and who should we bring that to? Micheal, and I might add my own opinion on that as well. Thank you, Brendan. Sorry, table 1, not table 3. Micheal?
That's a very provocative question, Brendan. Yes, I think first of all we are operating on the basis that there is a biodiversity crisis. First of all, as Evan has said earlier on, the Dáil has declared that there's a biodiversity crisis or emergency a couple of years ago, and when the terms of reference for this Citizens' Assembly was being drafted, it came from that, and you could say that that was a recognition that more needs to be done. In other words, the Dáil, the Oireachtas, has asked this group to come back with recommendations. My own comment to add to that is, having worked in a number of state agencies, we don't yet have an adequate set of policies, integrated policies, to address biodiversity loss in the country. There's a lot of work to be done. Yeah.
Thanks. Thank you, Micheal. Taz?
Yeah, so there, and it is a very good question, it's an important one, and we would say that, everything that you heard from Robert Watson at a global scale applies to Ireland to varying degrees as well, so I would take that on board. And so there are a number of sets of data and information that give us clues to that. So there's reporting that Ireland has to do in relation to European legislation and in relation to conventional biological diversity. So those reports are publicly available, and actually it might be beneficial to try and capture some summaries from those reports, which we're not really going to go into that level of technical detail today, but that shows a lot of trends of diminishing environmental quality in environment in a number of different contexts, and loss of species and so on, or degradation of species populations and so on. So that information is there, but it's also important to remember that when you read those reports that we're actually lacking a lot of information too. So where we have looked, and the species and habitats that we are obliged to monitor and report on, which is almost the extent of the resourcing that's been given to that question, it shows up a number of significant problems with Irish biodiversity and biodiversity loss. But actually we're also missing a large amount of information to make a proper assessment on that, and that's very important as well. So we need more information to better guide, better understand the nature of the biodiversity crisis in Ireland, and to be a better basis for the decisions around how to address it.
So Brendan, I'm not sure if that answers your question. I think we'll have more conversations on it because it's important, but as I said from the beginning, we will work within our terms of reference and it'll be evidence-based. And what the evidence is telling us so far that I don't think we need to spend more time on is that there is a biodiversity crisis. You mightn't think it. Even my own mother this morning was just like, the bird song outside the back door this morning was lovely. I was like, that's wonderful, Mum, but it's not happening everywhere. So I think we need to take it from that point, but thank you. I think that's a great question that we need to start deliberating on. Now, there's a question on table 5. 10, oh gosh, okay, so we're going to be short on time 7 as well. What I might do at this point, if that's okay, is take 7, 10, 5, and then take 11 and 6, and then we'll go for our family photo. So I'll take the I'll take the questions, and then we'll go to the panel, and then I'll take these 2 questions, and we'll go to the panel. Is that okay? So table 7, table 10, and table 5 have questions now. If we don't mind going to those. Thank you.
Carmel, okay. Hi, Carmel is my name, and excuse me, it's just an extension really of Table 1's question, so I won't take long, but from a national perspective, I suppose that's what we kind of came up with here, and that's going to be, if you like, our role here is to recommend something from a national perspective. And biodiversity is made up of lots of different parts, and just back to the gentleman in the lovely pink jumper. Sorry, I can't read your name from here, Micheal. And, you know, we do have national and government review of this whole situation, you know. But is it actually formulated? Is it structured? Is there a plan on the different parts of biodiversity that we can, you know, influence? So we talk about the farming aspect of it. We talk about, you know, the birds and the bees all around us at home, and so on and so forth, that children in education can influence those parts. So I suppose that was really the question. Has it been broken down? Is there a structured plan? Is it informed, and is it measured?
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Carmel. I'll bring that to the group. If we can go to table 10, please. Connor, thank you very much.
Hi, my name's Nicola. My question is on subsidy redirection. Is there currently any subsidy redirection occurring towards biodiversity, say in farming or fisheries, for example, to protect these systems? How do we implement this for big business? And does governmental policy change and implementation work? Are there any previous examples to give us some hope, either in Ireland or internationally, that something like this has happened?
Thank you, Nicola. In table 5, Dan had a question.
Hi, Dan. Just we were discussing here the last 2 years of COVID have been very difficult, but there have been some definite benefits to people being at home and rediscovering nature in their local area and things like that. And definitely people working from home and not travelling abroad as much, there's been reduction in carbon and all the rest of it. Is there a danger that if we don't start to promote that more and remember how good it has been over the last 2 years, that we'll lose the opportunity to capitalise on it, if you like? So we should be kind of keeping up the message of trying to get people to enjoy their surroundings more and to holiday at home and even work from home to reduce our carbon footprint and to basically reduce carbon footprint, look after the climate and biodiversity as a knock-on as well.
Thank you very much, Dan. I might actually just take all the questions now in the interest of time. Do you mind if we go to table 11 and then table 6? Thank you.
Hi, my name's Rui, and my question is, what incentives are out there or could be generated to facilitate good behaviour when it comes to biodiversity?
What do you mean by good behaviour, Rory? Is that everyone in general?
What was defined earlier as, like, the first question that was asked today was what is good? It's a world that seems to be run by profit when it comes to large corporations, so what maybe monetary incentives could be put in place?
Thank you. And we'll take this last question for now. We will have more opportunities for discussion and questions later.
I'm Liam. Professor Watson frightened the hell out of me.
Yeah.
And that made me think of attitude change. The amount of attitude change across the world and here in Ireland is frightening. Attitude change can be voluntary or it can be regulated with soft regulation or strong regulation. We all know what version of regulation we have been living with in this country. And it doesn't work, and it hasn't worked, and it causes enormous problems and an enormous amount of kicking the can down the road, the endless road. That can must be terribly damaged. I think if we're going to get anywhere here, we have got to go back to a level of strong regulation, because we all have experienced the damage the weak version of it has done. Thank you.
Thank you, Liam. Okay, so EAG, we have 5 minutes. No, we may take some of these later on and come back to them. The first question from Carmel, and I think maybe Taz, you might speak to this as part of the National Biodiversity Forum, and I know, Art, we're short on time. So, from the national perspective, is this issue being broken down? Is it being structured, formulated? Is there a plan that our recommendations can feed into?
In short, there is a plan. It's called the National Biodiversity Action Plan. We're currently within one, and we're currently developing the next one. So there is a process through which we look to break down the problem and propose a series of actions and solutions. And that is, again, that's a document that's available, and there is a consultation going to be taking place on the new plan very shortly, which you will have an opportunity to feed into. So that's something to look out for. I would follow that up with, as you said, is it broken down? Do we have different kind of areas which there's responsibility for and action points in place for? And that, in a way, that's where the challenge lies, is that there's different departments and state agencies have responsibility for different aspects of biodiversity, or they have impacts on biodiversity without necessarily having a sense of, that there's a written-in responsibility for it. And so the challenge is to try to get more joined-up thinking, shall we say, between the different departments with different levels of responsibility. So I think there's a lot of room for improvement in that regard.
And on that, Carmel, we've already been thinking about the timelines for the next National Biodiversity Plan, and to make sure that what we're talking about aligns with that and lines up, that we're all on the same message and feeding into that in some way or another. So it's on the radar, but again, we'll discuss it more. On subsidies, redirection for farming and fisheries. Now, James Moran, who couldn't just be with us today, would be our expert on that. Micheal, are you happy to take that for now?
Yeah, in the absence of James Moran, there were two questions, one on subsidies and second one then about incentives, and to some extent they're both linked. One of the ways to think about that is that the latest version of the Common Agricultural Policy that's been agreed for the next period of time does allocate 25% of the overall budget, the CAP budget, which is crucial to Irish agriculture and Irish farming, towards biodiversity or high nature farming or environmental measures. So a lot more than before, and that's a big step forward, it's a big change, and James could talk about that a little bit. But that's just one example where there is a form of subsidy already in place which is being redirected. But what's needed then is a lot more robust monitoring, going back to what Taz has said about data, to make sure that that's working. Another way of thinking about it is the carbon tax, to some extent, is a form of tax on the use of carbon, which was mentioned very much by Robert Watson, which will now be redirected. Not necessarily redirected towards biodiversity, though. It's been redirected towards alleviating fuel poverty and so on. On the question of what incentives are available, which is another way of putting the question, I think Rory asked it. Again, it's quite narrow, Rory. There is, you can see, evidence in the area of agriculture of incentives being provided, and there is a lot of good practice. Going back to the very first question we had about what does good look like, there are parts of Ireland where you can say for example, the Burren in County Clare, and other examples like that, 20 or 30 farming communities where they really have taken on board what good should look like. And we'll hear examples of that from the River Bride and various places. But again, it's a small part of a much larger budget, and so the amount of incentives available, they're not, first of all, widely available, they're not taken up, and there is a cap of about 25% of the EU farm budget on that. But if you go beyond the area of agriculture, I think your answer is very relevant. It's not there. And the last comment I would make is just as regards, is there a plan, going back to what I think it was Carmel asked it, and Taz said, yes, there is a national biodiversity plan. The reality is, folks, that plan is not a mandatory plan. It is not one that the state has to implement. It's not got the same status. It's a climate action plan, which is legally binding on the various government departments. So whereas we have had a plan, there's been 4 plans, they're not being implemented because there isn't the force of law behind them.
Thank you, Micheal. Mary, briefly, if you don't mind.
Yeah, no, don't worry. All of the questions kind of interlink with each other. And I think what you're seeing is that it's not just one tool. So the gentleman there was saying about we need to turn to hard regulation and binding law. That is one option, and it can back up things like the plans that are there as well, so you can incorporate them in. But we can use incentives, we can use deterrence. We've had things like the plastic bag levy. We've had things like tax incentives to use solar panels and so forth, but they're limited as to who they benefit as well. We need to consider the interaction between the environment and the fact that some people will not be able to change their behaviour without supports. They need that, they use the land in a certain way because that's all they can see themselves being able to do without supports that are there. I work on agricultural policy as well, and the mechanisms that are there for the subsidies are great in principle and idea, but they're not necessarily working effectively. And we need to see over the next few months with all of you the options, the various options that are available, and how we can make steps to improve any or all of them if you feel like it as well.
Mary, my apologies. You are a CAP expert as well, so my apologies for that. Dan and Liam, that kind of sidesteps your question, but I think the questions that you ask on Attitude Change are almost, they're too broad now to consider in the short amount of time that we have before lunch, but I'm going to note them here because I think it's something that we need to definitely come back to, potentially to discuss with behavioural economists as well as our experts here, and something to consider overall. And I think the national conversations around them are going to be key. So thank you sincerely for that. I also want to recognise we have members of the Assembly who are farmers and are experiencing this, and hopefully through our discussions we'll hear on the ground as well, you know, what that actually looks like. We have all the incentives in theory, but what are they actually like in practice? So leaving it at that, I feel like we're getting our teeth into the nitty-gritty, and now we're going to pause for lunch. But actually, lunchtime will be all of those conversations, and we will bring them back, and we will have further questions and answers later in this afternoon. So for now, if you want, you can leave your items here, bring whatever you need. We'll gather on the stairwell for a quick photograph, and then we'll go for our lunch. I don't want to lose the enthusiasm. I feel like we've started to think about this overwhelming problem, and it's complex. We have 6 months, and we will do it. So with that, enjoy your lunch, and I'll see you back here afterwards. Okay, thank you.